Hello everyone, welcome. In this screencast I'll be talking about how to get started working with Ruby on Rails in a professional or collaborative environment once you've become familiar with the basics. There are a lot of great learning resources out there for Rails like Code Academy or codeschool.com, and I found that a lot of them are really good at teaching how to use Rails, with all the models and the controllers and the different features, but they don't really go into general Rails workflows and development best practices. So that's what I'm going to cover in this video. I'd like to go over the overall development process, from the tools you might use to actually writing code to verifying that your code actually works before moving on. In the demos here, I'll be working on an actual real-world project that my company's been hired to build. To protect my client's identity and business strategies, I've blacked out and censored various identifying and sensitive information, with permission, of course. But, we are working with an actual project here, so what you're seeing is features that I'm building into this project that will be used in the final version. Now, when you do start a Rails project or jump into an existing project, you should be aware of a couple things. First, there are a set of general community standards and conventions regarding how to do things in Ruby and Rails. Specifically, I'm referring to the Ruby style guide and the corresponding Rails style guide. Keep in mind that they are guides, so there is some flexibility here, but you should familiarize yourself with these and try to adhere to them as much as possible. And this just helps keep your code readable and consistent. And if someone inherits the project from you, they will be able to work their way through it fairly quickly. There's also a really great gem out there called RuboCop, which will analyze your code according to the Ruby style guide and help you pinpoint areas that need attention. Okay, so when you're working with Rails, you'll basically only ever need three things: your terminal, a text editor, and a browser. You might use additional tools if you're working on a specific thing. I know a lot of people like to use a special REST client. This is the Advanced REST client, available in the Google Chrome App Store to help you debug APIs and whatnot. Some people like to use, work mostly in the terminal. They'll use Tmux and Vim and stuff like that. But really it just boils down to these three things. Here I'm using Hyperterm. It doesn't really matter what terminal you're using as long as you're familiar with it. And Atom as a text editor as well. I'm using Chrome, which is excellent. Also comes with the Google Chrome developer tools, which is very helpful. I know Mozilla Firefox also has some similar developer tools, as does Safari. Now, you shouldn't really ever be using your operating system's file browser to interact with your project files, basically ever. You should really get into the habit of using your terminal and the tree view on your text editor to interact with all of your files. Now, the very first thing you should do when you start getting to work is to open up your terminal and start your Rails server. It's a good idea to have this running so that you can kind of be testing as you go and verify that things are working. So in this app, one of the things we'll be needing is a restaurant model. So let's go ahead and create that. Rails comes with a lot of great generators that you should be using. You shouldn't really ever have to create any files manually. You should always use the Rails generators wherever possible. Probably you'll be using the migration, resource, and scaffold generators most often. So let's go ahead and create our restaurant resource. You can type the generator without any arguments to see the examples of how the syntax works. So we'll do Rails G for generate, resource, restaurant. We'll give it a name, restaurant type, description. We'll add an address ID. I'll add that later, actually. So hit enter, and we can see that Rails has created all of these files for us, which is what we want. We don't want to have to create any of these manually, because Rails will give us the right syntax and help us follow conventions and generally save us time. So let's go ahead and pop into our newly created model here. Now, you should see the Rails style guide for some tips on how to structure your models, but generally you should put any kind of includes at the top, like if you need to include some functionality from a gem. Next, we'll do our associations. Next, validations. After that, I like to have my scopes. Actually, I'll do callbacks before that. I'll do my scopes after that. I know the style guide says to put your scopes right at the top. I prefer to have them closer to the class methods since that's kind of what they are. Next, I do my instance methods. And then any private methods that you need to do after that at the end. Okay, so in this case, I want to validate that we have a name, presence true, and you should be using the new validation syntax here. You shouldn't really use the old syntax. It's just better to use the new one. We'll validate that we have a description. And our restaurant type. We want that as well. Okay, next for the controller. Now the resource generator will just give us a blank controller, so we'll just go ahead and fill this out. Do our before action, set restaurant. So this before action is going to provide an instance variable for us and actions that we want to use it. In this case, we're gonna want this in show, update, and destroy. And you can add any other actions you want here as well. And then after that, we just do our basic CRUD actions, starting with read, specifically index. In this case, we will want to set our instance variable for response. In this case, we're just going to get all our restaurants. And this is a JSON API, so we're rendering JSON. That's basically it. Next, we're going to do show. In this case, we do have access to our instance variable. After that comes create. I'm going to enter that in later. Update. Destroy. Now, if you were using a full stack Rails project with server-side rendering and views and all that, you would add in your new and your edit actions as well. In this case, since this is an API, we don't have that. After that, we're going to have our private methods. I think it's also worth noting, if you did need any other special actions, they would probably go after destroy, just to keep things organized. Okay, so this is where we're going to specify our before action, where we set that instance variable. We're just going to find based on our param and our strong params. Very important. You should always use strong params for your create actions. And since this is a JSON API, it does follow the JSON API spec, we're going to require a data key and an attributes key. And we've got our name, description, restaurant type. Okay, that looks pretty good. If you do write any special actions, you should also probably write a comment above each one specifying what the endpoint of that action is. On these basic ones, it's pretty obvious what that is, but it is a good habit to get into. Something like that would do. And after a while, you'll know this structure like the back of your hand. This is basically how all Rails controllers are going to look, more or less. Well, let's pop into our terminal, and before we test this in our browser, we can open up our Rails console and just go ahead and create a new restaurant. The Rails console is something that's super useful, and you'll probably be using it quite a bit. It allows you to debug and test things, and I don't have any way to create these restaurants yet via the API, so I can just do it really quickly here. Let's call it Joe's Coffee Shop. Give it a description. Best coffee ever. This is a cafe. I'll hit save. Another great thing about the console is that we can see the SQL queries that Active Record is generating when it runs these processes, which is useful for debugging or optimizing when you get to that stage. Right, so we can head back into our browser, and there it is. Looking good. So the serializer here is basically replacing our views and an API, and the serializer is a file that the generator gave us as well. And this is functionality provided by the Active Model Serializers gem, which is fairly widely used in the world of Rails APIs. So we can specify, if we want to add more attributes to be serialized, we can do that quite easily. And then, we can just hit refresh, and there it is. Very easy. Next, I'd like to add some rating functionality to my restaurants, since we want users to be able to rate them. So I'm going to go ahead and, I've already created a rating model. I used the scaffold generator this time, like that, and then I passed in my attributes. The nice thing about the scaffold generator is that it assumes that you're creating a RESTful resource and fills out some of the controller stuff for you. So you can see this is my ratings controller, and this is all automatically filled out by Rails. Notice it's the same structure that we created in our restaurants controller. So this is where that convention comes from. Now, if you do use the scaffold generator, keep in mind that you may have to change some of this according to the needs of your application. For example, down here at the strong parameters section, I had to change this to match the structure of our parameters. Now, our ratings model here is polymorphic, since we may want to be able to rate other models besides just restaurants. So I'm going to go ahead and add that relationship to our restaurants. Do has many ratings as rateable. And this is what that looks like in our rating model. I would also like to be able to get the average rating of a restaurant, so I'm going to define that as an instance method. I think something like this would do. So we can head back into our Rails console and test this out. Let's pull up a restaurant. Now notice that on this restaurant we don't have any ratings yet. So if our function works as expected, we can run average rating on this restaurant and receive a nil, which we do. Let's go ahead and test out the rest of our functionality by adding a rating to this restaurant. Do ratings, create. Let's give it a 5. Okay, now if we run our average rating again, we should receive a 5. Perfect. Next, we can head back into our serializer and add this to the serializer so that we can see this in our response. Do average rating. Now in active model serializers, we can still serialize this even though it's not a real attribute. We can do that by specifying a method of the same name as the attribute, just like that. Object here in active model serializers refers to the object being serialized. So now we can go back to our browser, and there's our rating. Now if we want to, we can also return a list of all of the ratings so that we can see each individual rating. We can do this in the serializer much the same way that we would define a relationship in the model. You could simply say has many ratings. Now, when we refresh this, we should see a new relationships object specifying the ID of each rating. Now, that doesn't really provide us much information other than the fact that this restaurant has ratings. Now we can include those ratings by specifying in our controller that we want to include those in our response. Say include ratings. Head back into our browser. There they are. Okay, so this looks pretty good. This is usable so far. I think the rest of the functionality is outside the scope of this video, but we would want to add tests to this functionality as well, just to make sure that if we change this, that our expected results will stay the same. So once we add those tests, we've already checked this in the browser, so we'd have a high degree of confidence that this functionality works as we expected. So we could commit this and push to our repository and move on. So all of that is basically the way that I work. You don't necessarily have to do things the way that I've shown here. In any case, I hope this has been helpful. Hopefully you now have some ideas about how you can take what you've learned about Rails and put it to use effectively. In the next video, I'll be jumping into the front end to continue to work on our restaurant model in Angular. I'll see you then.